Continuing on with Myers, we're going to begin now with chapter 13, The Gods Slept on Their Heads. And as you see from the first page, he begins talking about Putin and the oligarchs. And I want you to remember the social contract that Putin made with the oligarchs, or the informal compact, however you want to describe it. Know what that was about and how that was going to impact upon the decision to arrest Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the head of Yukos, and the dismantling of that major oil company. Right? That's one of the major themes in here. And you should know what happened to the main assets of Yukos after it was broken up. Um, this chapter talks about the increasing tension between the United States and Russia um, regarding the decision of the Bush administration to invade Iraq, where the Putin regime, with its ties to the Iraqi administration, was pushing for more negotiations and less outright military alliance. And so you see this as part of this increasing, growing separation between the United States and Russia uh, from the heydays of the post 9/11, when Russia perceived we were joining them in the fight against world terrorism, particularly Islamic terrorism. All right. Then there's more detailed information around 235 about the Yukos affair. Um, so you need to read that carefully, understand all that. Um, then it gets back to politics about the individuals that Khodorkovsky was supporting, um, that Putin's first prime minister, Kasyanov, was receiving aid from Khodorkovsky, and what the arrest of Khodorkovsky did to Western views of economic investment possibilities in Russia. All right, the next chapter, 14, Annus Horribilis, the horrible year. Why is this chapter about a horrible year? Why is that? So understand what that is. Uh, Particularly when it says that, since it's talking about 2004, on 244, it says that Putin began 2004 at the peak of his political power. So why is that a particularly terrible year? Understand those events that took place in there in order that they took place. Okay, you need to keep the chronology. That's why I teach the course from a chronological perspective, so you can put all this into your perspective. All right, moving on. So we talk about continuing terrorist attacks on 246. I just went by it. Um, he talks about managed democracy and the role of Sorkov, who is this kind of advisor, younger guy who helps mold this image of Putin, and is a good wordsmith. He comes up with combinations of these words like sovereign democracy, managed democracy, that helps uh, give some structure to the positions that Putin has been pushing. So know who he is, and certainly you need to understand that concept of managed democracy. And moving on to 251, talk about the presidential election and the results there. I love the line on 251. Putin's election followed the script that Sukratov political team had written for him. So Surkov puts together this team, and the election candidates, there's no real serious opposition. It's more almost a coronation rather than an election. And also on 252, it talks about um, the liberal debacle that basically after 2004 election, the liberals that wanted to bring Russia more in line with the West are pretty much non-existent in major policy decisions. They're not involved in the Duma. They're pretty much driven out after this point. And so understand that and the reasons why. And certainly, moving on to 254, you've got to be aware of the terrible incident in Beslan. It gives you a very good explanation for it, so you should know what happened, how it happened, and then as a result of that, of course, Putin links a whole series of changes that he advertises them as part of a effort to fight terrorism. But when you look at those quote reforms from 261 on, you begin to see that they are really more shoring up Putin's power. He is attacking the governors again, eliminating the election by district, by constituency, so amending the law on parties to now do away with single district voting, and everyone has to come from the constituency list or the proportional representation list. All right, so that next chapter, 15, the orange contagion. You got to know what this is, right? What he's talking about here. What is this? The concern of the consequences of the color revolution, the orange revolution in Ukraine, and what that would mean for Putin's rule. All right. About 267, I think it is, he talks there about NATO expansion and how this NATO expansion, on top of the decision to invade Iraq, and the increasing criticism of the nature of Putin's democracy. Remember Putin saying that we don't want to be lectured to about democracy. These are the factors that are driving the U.S. and Russia further apart. Let's move on. The first time he introduces this new youth group, Nashi, is I think about on 276. Nashi means ours, and this is like the youth wing of the United Russia Party, a youth movement that is committed to Putin and Putin's policies, committed to United Russia, trying to win the young people away from fascination with the West to a solidly pro-Putin position. And often these young people are involved in breaking up protest movements. So it's part of Putin's continuing efforts not only to manage democracy, but to manage civil society. In some ways, this is a replacement for the old communist Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, trying to build support for the regime. Next, go up to about 284 or somewhere in there, talking about Gazprom, and Gazprom is incredibly important. It is this major gas monopoly. It is poorly run, mismanaged. I'm going to talk about that in a separate lecture later, but it is terribly important for Putin's cronies. Many of his personal friends from St. Petersburg have become billionaires because they have been able to buy up at practically, pennies, and I do mean pennies on $1 million for parts of Gazprom. So it talks about this integral relationship, and it also talks here about Putin's obsession with creating these national champions, these state monopolies. And the sad thing, because often some people talk about Russia as now a state capitalist society where the state controls many of the capitalist organizations. But what's also happened, and it is particularly with Gazprom, because Gazprom is a cash cow for Putin's people and his allies, is that these state enterprises like Gazprom and Rosneft are really led by close allies of Putin, friends of Putin, and these friends become millionaires and billionaires because of their ties to him and their leadership of these state enterprises. So it's not so much that he's created these big companies that benefit the state. They benefited essentially Putin's allies. And there's a lot of economics in the West who say that these companies are badly managed. That many times the decision is made for political reasons, not economic reasons. They're made not in benefit of the stockholders, because the state owns about half of it, but they're benefiting Putin and Putin's regime. All right, so it's a very different nature of what often is thought of as state capitalism. Moving on, then why you should know why the Yukos affair is considered by Myers, and I think he's right, that it is a real turning point in the way that Putin is going to approach companies and resources and the overall Russian economy. So why is it a turning point? That's a good, I think, question that you should know. All right, we move then to the next chapter. Um, oh no, I guess I am in the chapter uh, called Kremlin Inc. Chapter 16. Kremlin Inc. What does this mean? This is you really have to understand this chapter because it links the regime into these major corporations. It links the economy together and understands how the the Russian economy seems to operate under the direction of Putin, Putin's allies, all for the benefit of Putin, the benefit of his regime, not necessarily the entire state, not necessarily the people of Russia. So understand what all of that means. Later, then, there's that discussion of the people who are close to Putin, as what I call his cronies, and the um, Yuri Kovalchuk, who is the head of Bank Rossiya, which Western investigators have claimed is Putin's bank. It's the bank for all Putin's friends. So this fits this in with the increasing control of the state by a handful of Putin's allies. So understand that. Um, and it goes on for several pages there discussing who are these people and how they came to be close to him. Now, the next chapter is chapter 17, poison. And if you've been paying attention, what are we going to talk about in chapter 17? But the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko, right? With polonium 210. And so this chapter talks a lot about the efforts to squelch opposition, to eliminate dissent, um, and its history. It talks about the murder in 2006 of Anna Politkovskaya, this great reporter who wrote numerous articles, and several books have been published of hers that are very critical of the Putin regime, particularly the human rights abuses, especially in regard to the war in Chechnya. Uh, and in fact, uh, there is a line on 208 that says she was the last casualty of Putin's the victorious war against the Chechens, because the second Chechen war has gone well for the Russians, and it's gone well partially because they have begun to rely upon allies in Chechnya that will support Putin and crush any opposition to Putin uh, in the republic. And this is Kadyrov, and it's been and pretty successful, and they've become a great ally of Putin. And he's used Chechens for a number of nefarious activities, including probably the assassination of the liberal critic Boris Nemtsov. All right, so it's a long chapter, and again, I hope you read this book carefully, not just the points that I'm highlighting, because there is so much in here that you need to understand. And since we don't have the daily lectures and you have to rely upon these videos, the book, I think, gives you this pretty good history of Putin, at least up to 2015-16. Unfortunately, after 2015-16, you're going to have to rely upon the videos. But all right, so 2008 talks about the efforts to get um, uh, the Olympics. I think of the word. Sorry, the Olympics to the Winter Olympics to come to Russia. Um, so why does it become so important that to Putin to get the Winter Olympics? Why is that such a critical thing for him? Why is that the case? Later, then, there's an interesting section that talks about the so-called War of the Clans. Again, if you remember back in 1998, we talked about the War of the Bankers. But I warned this was not a bloody, shoot 'em up kind of war. This was use of propaganda, leakage, articles in the press criticizing your opponents. Well, the same thing is taking place again um, with these various groups that are around Putin fighting over resources, fighting over control of state assets. And so you should know who was involved and what this means. This particular one is talking largely about the Silovoki, the factions within the power ministries that hate each other and are jealous of each other and looking to get a leg up on their opponents. So this is this internal squabbling between the factions that are circled around and supporting ultimately the Putin regime. All right. Then the chapter goes on. Well, first of all, I should have asked you this: what is the 2008 problem? You should know that. That's a question that begs being answered. But the way Putin's dilemmas are solved, he comes up with this concept that's called the tandem or the castling move. I don't know how many of you play chess, but castling is a move where you a move designed to protect the king, where this rook who has can move only in straight lines comes and protects the king. Put the king in the corner, and this rook piece can protect him. So think about this. This is all about where Putin switches, makes this deal with his ally Dmitry Medvedev. You take the presidency for the next 4 years. I'll take the prime ministership, and that's the tandem. It's like a bicycle built for two. Tandem meaning two. You get two, for the price of one, essentially. That was the argument here. So, good question is, why did he choose Medvedev? Why Medvedev of all the other people around him? And Myers gives a pretty good explanation, I think, for that. The next chapter, 19, is called the Regency. And a regent is, maybe you know, but a regent is someone who rules when the king is either too young or ill or disposed for a certain reason. So what is this referring to? That Medvedev becomes the regent. He's the president, but he is the president without a lot of the power because Putin is right there, and Putin continues, as I showed in my lectures, to make many of the decisions that principally the president would make. So while he's prime minister, the prime minister is supposed to run the government and help structure the Duma. Through United Russia, the party that's dominant in the Duma, Putin continues to make decisions that really the president is supposed to make. So read that. That also in that section or in that chapter is the discussion of the war in Georgia, and you should know, read about that, understand what was the causes of that, and whether it was successful or not. Then also it talks about in 2008, the financial crisis, how that hits Russia, how devastating it is across the world. But Russia, of all of the countries in the world, probably does better than most. They're able to survive this. I've talked about this in my lectures also. And they did this because of the economic reforms that Putin pushed um, to bring in a steady tax flow. He reorganized the tax code. Um, and this is they have built a sovereign wealth fund, uh, what I've called rainy day funds. These large amounts of money that are held in trust and held back in case of a crisis, and so they have been used to shore up the economy. So they came out fairly well out of the 2008. But who was hurt by these crises largely are the average Russian and a number of the oligarchs. Again, this is shaking up the oligarchs so that Putin can begin to bring his own people to the forefront. And so that largely, when you look at the Putin years, most of the oligarchs from that first handout overhead that I gave you about oligarchs, those were all who amassed their wealth during the Yeltsin years. They pretty much have disappeared. Um, some have been bought out by Putin's allies, but most of the Yeltsin oligarchs have left the country, living off of the millions, if not billions, that they stole and socked away in offshore banks. So they're living in London or Israel or France off of the money that they stole from the state in the early privatizations. All right, where am I now? All right, he also talks about opposition to, Chap talking about the opposition to Putin by Garry Kasparov, world chess champion, Boris Nemtsov, the old governor, not old, he's a young fellow, relatively young, the young guy from Nizhny Novgorod who had been a deputy prime minister for Yeltsin, part of the dream team, if you remember that phrase. And how they have been trying to rally elements of civil society to oppose the Putin administration. Uh, and the chapter ends talking about that constitutional change that is going to impact the presidency, extending the presidency from 4 years the next time in 2012 to 6 year terms. Okay, so 2012 is important. Uh, Chapter 20, the discussion of the action man. And if you read in there, there's a section that talks about Putin as the action man. Medvedev was the man of words. And the contrast between these two is the theme there. So a question again is, what was Putin hoping to achieve by hosting the Winter Olympics? What was the goal of that? And that is discussed in the book. Also, in this chapter, you have a very good discussion of the Magnitsky affair, the effort to investigate the corruption in companies owned by this Western American investor, Bill Broder. And Sergei Magnitsky was his uh, accountant that he hired to do this investigation. And of course, poor Magnitsky gets arrested, charged with the very crimes he's investigating, and he dies in prison, in police custody. And this then provokes a series of sanctions from the West against these people. These are sanctions associated with Magnitsky. You know, the Russian response and Putin's response was to end uh, adoption of Russian children by Americans, and so this is all discussed in that section pretty thoroughly there. Um, it talks a lot about the corruption that is associated with the building of the Sochi Olympics and the facilities there, the transportation, and who are the people who are benefiting from this, but these close old friends of Putin's, the Rottenbergs and Timoshenko that I'm going to talk about. It also talks about the protest in the Kimsky Forest, the effort to build this big superhighway from Moscow to St. Petersburg through one of these last surviving natural growth forests that are important surrounding Russia, and they were going to build this enormous highway right through the middle of it. This provoked some response, so it shows that there is still opposition, or still some opposition. Talks also about the truckers who oppose some of the uh, creating these toll roads that drive up the cost, and these independent truckers are protesting against it. Largely, the regime tends to ignore them, but there is still this opposition in the general society. And of course, chapter 21, the return. Well, the return of what? The return of Putin to the presidency. Um, he talks in here at some length about the Putin's nemesis, if you will, Alexei Navalny, uh, how he is a constant using his blog, building. He has a foundation that he's created, building support among the people to oppose the Putin regime, and describing how he goes about doing that. Also, this chapter talks about the Arab Spring and what does this mean for Putin. Uh, Putin believes that the Arab Spring was initiated by the West, and he believes that it is the West trying to impose their definition of democracy upon the world, and that's led to the overthrow of the dictatorship in Egypt, to the dictatorship in Libya under Gaddafi, the uprising in Syria against the Assad family, and so Putin is fearful of this, as I've iterated several times. He's also fearful of the orange contagion. He's fearful of the possibility of color revolution coming in Russia that would tend to shake up and destroy his regime. All right, so we go on. We talk. This talks about still the problems of Medvedev adjusting to the back to the role of prime minister. It talks about their relationship. Um, Also, in this chapter, there's a good section on the Putin's view of democracy, and you really need to understand that. And talk about his observation of the collapse of the Soviet satellites in eastern Germany, the uh, devastating impact to him of the loss of Sobchak when he ran for re-election in a relatively free and open election in 1996. And so now you have Putin managing his democracy, structuring it, building these pro United Russia opposition parties, parties that ostensibly campaign against the party of power, but are basically willing to support it and cut deals and work along with it. Um, so that's all through this chapter here. I think also, yeah, in this chapter he talks about his dissertation and I think that's where it's the reference to the University of Pittsburgh people uh, who he plagiarized sections of his dissertation out of that. Um, Talks about the creation of a this new party, this quote opposition party, the right cause, that is started by the owner of the New York, not the Nets, I think the New York Nets, Mikhail Prokhorov, this wealthy guy who's encouraged to create this party, but then when he finds that he really the party is not his, it's really Putin's creation, Putin's allies' creation. He winds up giving up his role in leadership in the party, and the party is now called Just Russia. So there's a good section there talking about the development of these parties, and that relates to the chapter in the Sokwa book that hopefully you remember. Um, all right, and then also more of a section against the opposition that comes out after the 2011 election in the Blotnaya Square protests. These were tens of thousands of protesters that come out in the city protesting the opposition and the threat they pose to the regime. It talks about sort of the gray cardinal, as he's described, the man behind the scenes, the strategist for much of Putin's early years. Um, and I think that's a good place to end because it's the end of chapter 5, part 5, the beginning of part 5. And I'll take up on the next video from chapter 2, perhaps to the end of the book. We'll see if we can get it all in there. All right. That is it for this one.